in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Understanding the Unique Issues of Kinship Adoption, being offered as part of the ASAP Post-Conference webinar series that will be held the second Wednesday of each month through April of 2016. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items related to today's webinar. You will notice a Zoom viewer button in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. You can use this button to adjust the size of your webinar screen. Secondly, in the control panel located on the upper right-hand side of your screen, you will see the word questions listed. You can use the plus and minus button to open or close this box. If you have a question for Edie, you can enter it here. Time permitting, any questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. And now I am pleased to introduce our presenter for today's webinar,
Edie Swiler with Lilliput Children's Services. Edie serves as the Clinical Training Director at Lilliput. She has over 25 years of clinical experience serving families in child welfare, community mental health, and private practice settings. Edie is an adoptive parent, experienced parent educator, and trainer. She has developed numerous curriculums and trainings for educators and clinicians on topics specific to the needs of adoptive and kinship families. Edie also serves as a lead trainer for CASE's Training for Adoption Competency in Northern California. Additionally, she has spoken at local and national conferences on topics focused on issues related to trauma and permanency. Edie, thank you for taking the time to share with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody in Harmony and all of those people, all of you to make the ASAP conference a success. I was fortunate enough to be able to be there and present with CASE, and it was just a really wonderful conference, and I was really proud to be a part of it. So I just want to say that up front. I'm excited to be here today. This is my first webinar, so I appreciate patience if there's technical issues. Cindy and Nicole are just been great in helping me get this off the ground, so I'm excited to be here with you. Before we start, I wanted to just get some information about, oops, I'm trying to get our polls here. I wanted to get some information about all of you, and Cindy, I'm noticing that I can't access the polling here for whatever reason. It just seems to have disappeared off my screen.
We got it. We've got it
okay
for you, Edie.
Okay, great. So the first question I wanted to ask was to get a little bit of information about you. So if you could look at the questions and kind of say which category that you might fit in. And so I'm not still seeing it, Cindy, just so that you know. So since I'm not able to do that, I'm going to just go ahead with the presentation so we don't waste time. So I want to tell you a little bit about the agency that I work with. I work with Lilliput Children's Services, and we're an agency that began as a foster care agency about 32 years ago now, and we moved quickly into finding permanency for children. Our message has always been to ensure that children have safe, nurturing, and permanent families. We serve over 13 counties throughout Southern California, Northern California, and more recently in some services in Southern California as well, providing conversion home studies and some other kinds of post-adoption support services. Adoption, post-adoption, foster care, kinship, clinical services, and trainings in various offices throughout the county, throughout these counties. Oops. We specialize in permanency through kinship care, and we serve kinship families in 5 Northern California counties. We provide a variety of services, including relative certification, family finding, navigation, counseling, and preparing for adoption and post-adoption services, depending on the county. So I want to talk a little bit about why we see that kinship care is beneficial. Children, there's research that shows that children removed from their homes after reports of maltreatment have significantly fewer behavior problems 3 years after placement with relatives than those that are placed with non-relatives in foster care. This was one study that was conducted through the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. But if people are interested in looking at other studies, one of the easiest places to gather that information is to go onto the Child Welfare Information Gateway. There's a number of various studies that you can look at if you want more information. I'm going to talk about a few of those benefits today since we only have an hour, and we're going to highlight a few of those. So first and foremost, that we know that kinship care allows children to live with persons that they know and hopefully trust, and even when they're placed with family relatives that they may not know, there is still some opportunity to have that connection as in their history. We know that it reduces the trauma that children may experience when placed with persons initially unknown to them, or it also reduces the amount of moves. We know that it reinforces child's sense of identity and self-esteem. There isn't this always wondering about if these people are connected to me, if they're going to stay connected to me. We know that there's a sense of feeling like they're not removed from their family, and that we know is really helpful to kids. It facilitates children's connections to their siblings more often and to their history. And of course, there are some unique challenges, and what I want to talk a little bit about is social worker bias. So what we have seen is that there is a typically and more traditionally, and there's some changes, and it's great to see, is that for a long time placing children with relatives was in some cases seen as not appropriate. And throughout, with all the research now in kinship care, fortunately that's changing, but we're still seeing in some counties and some social worker bias, particularly if we're looking at comparing placing children in concurrent homes where maybe the families in those adoptive families, non-relative adoptive families, are higher income, maybe live in what they consider safer neighborhoods, seem to be able to provide for children in ways that they don't consider relative caregivers able to do that. And so a lot of work sometimes still needs to be done to educate social workers about the importance of placing children with relatives. Clearly for caregivers, it's an unexpected role change. You go from being grandmother who gets to, maybe have the kids on the weekends and gets to spend, time spoiling them, and on all of a sudden that's not the case. So that can be really, really challenging. And also, a lot of times now what we're seeing is not just grandparents. We're now seeing older siblings. Maybe the kids were raised in foster care, and now an older sibling steps up because he doesn't want to see his younger sibling going to foster care. And so we see sometimes 20-year-olds raising, 3 and 4 little kids. And so it can be really, really challenging without support. Certainly it's mixed emotions. A lot of our caregivers say yes to the opportunity to raise their family members' children, but really, that isn't what they were really wanting to do. And then there's a lot of guilt and shame around maybe feeling like they're stealing the kids from the birth parents, or other family members are not supportive of it. All of a sudden, they're opening their home to agency involvement and having to abide by the decisions of others when maybe they were very private people. They've never been involved with maybe child welfare before. People are telling them what they have to do, that they have to modify their homes, that they have to do things that, that they feel like now they're retired, maybe if they're grandparents or older relatives. And so things can be quite topsy-turvy for them. Many of you, though, I'm sure, are familiar with Deborah Silverstein and Sharon Rosia, who wrote about the 7 core issues of adoption back in 1982 that has become the foundation for how to support children and families and around adoption issues. Joseph Crumbly, who has been an expert in his field for many years out of Philadelphia, he created what he identified as additional issues that he sees for core issues for relatives, caregivers, and I'm going to talk about a few of them today. So you'll see them all come on your screen. And of course, we don't have time to walk through every single one of them, so it's there for you to be able to look at. But I'm going to point out, we'll go through some of them. So just a quick read of them in terms of the highlights is, we do know that all of these kids experience loss, but all of our caregivers experience loss in many ways. Loss of their dream of what their children were to become, loss of their retirement, possibly, loss of the life that they had planned for themselves at a certain stage in their life, loss of their independence, to be able to be free to travel or to do the things that folks might do that don't have children. So there's significant loss for them. What we see is a lot of shame and embarrassment. How do they explain why these kids are living with them? How do they support these kids without feeling embarrassed because maybe they're blaming themselves for the way the children, their birth children or their relatives have treated the children that have gone into care, and maybe they feel like they contribute to that. Clearly, finances are an issue for our families. People did not expect this. When people consider adoption, they plan for it. They create a home, an environment to set up and be prepared. Many times in kinship families, kids are kind of just dropped off. They're not giving a lot of notice. And their whole life has to change in training how to support them, the children in their care. Boundary confusion and role changes are huge. And I'm going to talk about that more specifically later. This sense of resentment from extended family members. Either there are family members, maybe older children, who are saying, you can't do this, you're too old, you should be taking care of these kids, or, it's not fair, you're taking these children away from my sister or away from my cousin, and it's just not fair that you can do that, and there's a lot of anger and resentment, and then lack of support. Also from if the other children, so if there are grandparents and the other grandkids used to come over and hang out with them and have this special time with grandparents, now grandparents are exhausted because they're taking their kids all day, and the other children feel slighted. And then maybe the parents of those children are angry and upset that they don't have the opportunity to have their kids have their grandparents in the way that they imagined it. We'll talk about projection and transference, but typically here we're speaking about that a lot of grandparents particularly feel really that they have, like I said earlier, made a mistake in how they've parented. So we may see them projecting onto their kids, on the kids that they're now raising, that they're going to grow up to be like their parents. And so a lot of the parenting is about preventing that from happening instead of just really focusing on the issues of the children. Obviously, a lot of stress. There's a lot of physical limitations, especially with older caregivers, the reality of their morbidity and mortality, and then issues around bonding and attachment, which is true with all of our adopted families. Cindy, I'm just going to put this out that I'm still not seeing any of the poll questions, so I'm not sure how to get those back. Okay, next slide really talks about some of our goals for caregivers. And what we really want to look at here is, how can we help our families to be more successful, and how do we help our caregivers to really focus on what are the needs of the children in their care. So we want to look at claiming the child. So in a traditionally non-relative adoptive family, it's a little bit, it's hard there for sometimes we need to get adopted to be able to understand how important it is for them to take on that role as I am the parent. But with relatives, it's even more challenging. We have families often who will say, she'll always be my grandchild, he'll always be my nephew, which is understandable, considering that was the role that they had with that child maybe for many, many years. But for children, I think what's really important, whether they call them by name as grandparent or aunt or uncle, what the reality is they need to know that these are the people that are there for them and will continue to be there for them, and that when they need something and they need to be cared for, that they're cared for in the same way that any parent would care for their children. Discipline becomes an issue. To move from this role of spoiling your grandchildren or to hanging out with your nephew to now being the one who has to say you have to get your homework done, that you have to go to bed at a certain time, have to deal with all the tantrums that may come with kids who have had trauma, behavioral concerns, all of those things which they weren't prepared for. But most importantly, this understanding how this affects then the kids, because kids now feel like they may have another loss, which is they have lost the parent, the grandparent, or the aunt or uncle that was the fun person to hang out with, and now have to adapt to these people changing to be the disciplinarians for them. We need to have them understand about the importance of providing adequate limits and structure and boundaries. So, so this is all relatively new when these kids come into this home and without significant support, and the fact that people, particularly with grandparents, may have parented long before we understood some of the developmental needs of children that we do now, and also for older siblings who are parenting who have never had any parental experience, and they are taking on kids with these sometimes very significant challenges. There needs to be an understanding of the needs of safety as it relates to trauma, their medical, their education, their mental health decisions, many things that people may not be prepared for. Their goal is to really help kids then to minimize their grief and the separation experienced by the child. And this can be overwhelming when kids are in that place of just kind of understanding their loss. They may be angry with the caregivers. They may feel like those caregivers took them from their birth parents. They may not be able to have visits if it's not safe and may blame the caregivers. There may be a misunderstanding between how those children came to live in the home. And so it can become very, very challenging. We want to be able to help children integrate their trauma. And so how do we how do parents who never had any experience with that, who may now be, in their 70s sometimes, who've never really understood those specific needs of kids, who may also feel like they may have contributed to their children's trauma if they feel like they've done something wrong in terms of how they've parented the children's parents. They may have had their own history of trauma, and that then gets triggered by these kids' trauma. So there's a lot of issues that come up that can impact the relationships between the parent and the child. Dual loyalties, is another issue here. Children who really have to struggle between, if I allow my grandparents to be my parents, then am I turning my back on my birth parents? And how do I integrate all of that as a child? And that may mean that I may be angry. I may not want to show my grandparents or my relative that is caring for me that I can be accepted in this family, that I'm willing to be part of this family. Because if I say I'm willing to be part of this family, then sometimes I'm turning my back on my parents. So some challenges when we talked about boundaries and parenting is that some of our caregivers become so overprotective or permissive. Some will become very rigid in this fear that I will be you will be like your mother, and I'm never going to let that happen because I made mistakes. Or this other fear that maybe I was too tough on them, so I'm going to be really permissive, or maybe I just don't have it in me to be the disciplinarian now that I'm at a certain place in my life. There's this terrifying response we hear from caregivers all the time that these children are going to repeat those negative behaviors, and then they're fearful of failing once again. So caregivers may feel badly, like I said, for what they've done, blame themselves. They may blame the system. They blame other family members. They're just, when they're unsure or they're feeling, I think when they're struggling in the role, it can be easier to blame than it is to accept what's being placed in front of them. And helping caregivers to understand that and to feel okay about whatever they're feeling and to work with them through that is what the key is. So not so much an adoption, but we know that a lot of placements are informal. A caregiver may just have tried to rescue a child from a birth parent. They didn't want CPS intervention. Some of these placements start out very informally, so they may have these children for years before they consider adoption. And then it feels very intrusive when social workers are coming into the home, people are telling them how they should parent. They're doing these home studies that feel so intrusive when they've been having these kids in their home for years. There may feel pressure from other family members for setting limits on birth parents. So they may feel they may need to, their job is to keep kids safe, and if children are unable to be safe visiting a birth parent, there may be pressure from not only the birth parent but other relatives regarding their ability to let the parents and children see one another. This can be really difficult if you think about things like major holidays. What about Thanksgiving dinner? And if birth mom is there, does that mean that they can't go and take the children? Is child welfare putting restrictions on the visits? Many times we often see, at least here in California, that the relative caregivers are the ones that are providing the supervised visits. And that could be challenging because they have to be able to set very strong rules about what the birth parent can and cannot do. And that can be very difficult when it's your son or daughter who are the birth parents. Children become angry with caregivers. How come you won't let me see my mom? You're just mean. You don't care about my mom. You don't love her anymore. Very, very painful for caregivers to have to go through that. So one of the things that we really need to be able to do is figure out better ways to support our caregivers. And so here are a few of the ways that I'm going to talk about, some others as well. So we really want opportunities to help caregivers work through their own grievances. We know that the guilt and the shame and the loss that they carry, as well as their own trauma, impacts the relationships with their children. And the more that caregivers are triggered, the less they are able to claim the children and to provide really the conscious kind of therapeutic parenting that these kids need. So they need recommendations for their own therapy if that's possible, support groups where they can come together with other families in in similar situations, opportunities to be open and honest without feeling like they're going to be blamed. We need to let them speak openly to people about maybe how they've disciplined in the past without feeling judged for that, so they can forgive themselves and move on to be able to parent the kids that are now in their care. Many of our families really need immediate financial support, beds for the children who are now living in their home, because they didn't need 3 twin beds and now they do. What happens when you're on a fixed income and all of a sudden 3 kids are placed in your care and your check doesn't come for a month? What happens if kids come with no clothes and now we need to help them get a whole new wardrobe? Things like all of a sudden their gas bills is higher, or they're having to have internet services, and maybe they didn't need that before, but now the kids need it for school projects. So there's just a lot of things that we need to look at and how we can support families financially. And sometimes once we get them over the hump, they're okay on their own. We just have to get through that. It's not necessarily a decision that we should place a child in a family because they don't have they don't have a large enough an apartment, or they don't have furniture for the kids. If we can help them to get that, then they can be successful. Sometimes that is a huge piece of that. Also helping them to make connections to other family members who might be able to support them. So a lot of times, realizing that we can help them brainstorm that there are other family members who are willing to support these kids financially, as well as emotionally, and they don't have to do this all by themselves. We talked about support groups for connection to other caregivers, really some education on some updated parenting practice for traumatized children. It's may have been a long time since they've parented, but also now they're parenting kids who have experienced all the things we talked about earlier. How are we educating them, and how are we doing it in a way that helps them to see that we believe in their ability to do it, and that they have a right to be open and honest about what their challenges are. Linkages and advocacy to work through the system. So how do they navigate our child welfare system? How do they navigate? They have to work with the children's attorney. How to go to court? What kinds of things are okay to talk about and not to talk about? How do they access mental health services? Educate them about how they get educational services for children. And then, mediation with birth parents or other extended family is huge. A lot of times in our counseling services, there's a lot of time where we have birth parents and we have relatives in the room together, and we're talking about really important things. We're negotiating what they call each other. Something as simple as, who's the mom, right? How do we refer to grandma? What happens, what are the rules about visitation? Are there foods that can and cannot be brought into sessions? What happens if somebody says something inappropriate? Who stops that visit? And, what are the rules about if you come to a visit and you are intoxicated, or you're using drugs, or you're not staying on your mental health medication? All of those things we need to help families create those plans ahead of time so that they're not kind of felt left later. And then helping that whole sense of it takes a village to raise our kids is really important, I think, particularly with older caregivers, but younger caregivers too, who are alone or isolated. Who are the family members that can step up? So grandma and grandpa may not be able to navigate getting to, let's say, all the basketball practices or showing up for the swim meets, but maybe there's an uncle who's willing to step in that role. Maybe they're not able to help kids with their homework, but maybe there's a neighbor who can do that. Maybe there's relatives who have certain roles. The fear of a lot of our older relatives is, what happens if I die? What will happen to the kids? So what are the plans for those other caregivers if that happens? And how do we talk to the kids about that so that they know that they're supported? And most importantly, this concept of self-care. You ask a caregiver what they need, and they sometimes don't even know. They're just so completely overwhelmed. And one of the things that I think well-meaning therapists and social workers do is we make recommendations about self-care that are just not physically possible. You can tell somebody to join a gym. You can tell somebody to exercise a half an hour every day. You can tell people to journal. But if it just doesn't feel feasible, then people aren't going to do it. So what are the ways that we can help people to think for themselves? What are the kinds of ways that they can have self-care? Sometimes that means literally knowing that it's okay to lock the door if you take a shower, or being able to go for a walk and asking a neighbor to just come in and sit in the house for 20 minutes. It may be allowing somebody to know that while the kids are at school, they can just take a rest or take a nap and not feel guilty if they're not cleaning their house or running to take care of some other need for the children. And so it's that brainstorming with those caregivers. The other part of, I think, self-care is knowing who your supports are. And often when we're assessing families, we don't go deep enough to ask about those resources and those supports. So, for example, there's one thing to say, who are the people that you can contact if, you need support, and they can come up with a list. But the other is to say, who's that person at 4 o'clock in the morning when you just can't take it anymore and you're just not sure what you're supposed to do? Who's the person that you can, when the kids are suspended and you're at work, can go pick them up? Who's the person that can take the kids to, baseball practice because you can't? Those very specific kinds of assessment of their resources and their supports, and it should be updated often because the older children get, the more needs they might have, and then we need to kind of always be helping them reassess that. So we're going to talk a little bit about those core issues for children. I'm going to make a guess that many of you are familiar. I didn't get to see the responses to your poll, but I'm going to just assume that you all are here and this is not familiar to you, but to really kind of look at that these issues, whether children are adopted in a non-relative home or a relative home, really struggle with all of these issues. And you know, the piece here that is even more difficult for these kids are the sense of betrayal more than anything, especially because they're always reminded of their birth family, so of their birth parents, and so that can be struggling for them. It can be positive because if we can get relative caregivers to talk about birth parents, even though they've made mistakes, in positive ways, kids can begin to feel okay about where they are. And if we could get birth parents to talk to kids about the importance of accepting where they live, and parents giving a sense permission for their relative caregivers to care for them, kids can begin to feel more accepting of their situation and more welcoming of those relative caregivers. Role confusion we talked about earlier, but I just want to come back to that, is really, I think, for kids, can be challenging on a number of ways. One is, what is my relationship with this person? How has that changed, as we talked about earlier? But the other is even things like, how do they talk about who these people are, especially if they're older caregivers, especially if they're maybe of a different race than their caregivers, and supporting kids in being able to practice ways to talk about this and to be able to integrate and feel comfortable and knowing who they are to these people that are caring for them. The other thing that becomes difficult is if there are other children in the home when these kids are placed. So if I'm already a parent and this used to be my cousin, and now does this mean he's my brother? And how do I make sense out of that? And how do the other kids in the home feel? And that's huge. And a lot of what we don't necessarily take the time to pay attention to is, how are we preparing those siblings or the children previously in the home to welcome this child, so that this child doesn't feel like an outsider, so this child does feel like he's claimed by every member of the family. So what more do kids need? They need, let's go back. They need a place to share their grief and loss without worrying about hurting the adults in their lives, whether that's through counseling, through a church or synagogue, through family members who can help them through that. They need reassurance that they're safe and that caregivers will continue to provide safety. One of the reasons that claiming is so important is that if they're always wondering if these caregivers are going to return them, in quotes, or aren't really prepared to take care of them in the long run, if they're older, the fear may be, what happens if you can't keep me? They need to know that their birth parents have strengths. And the one positive thing, or one of the many positive things about living with relative caregivers, is that, they have stories. They have their history. They can say, oh, you smile just like your mom did. Or I remember when your mom was a little girl, she liked music too, just like you. Those things can be so important that kids in non-relative homes don't get that a lot of the times. They need to, we talked about earlier, how do you prepare children to talk about their living situation? So when all the other kindergarten parents are, in their 20s, and now my grandmother who's in her 70s, or she has white hair, how do I explain that to my friends when my friends say things like, who's that lady, and is that your grandma, or how come you don't look like them, or all of those things. The Center for Adoption Support and Education, some of you may be familiar with them out of Maryland. They also do the TAC training, which we're involved with, but they have a curriculum called Wise Up. And Wise Up focuses on teaching kids and preparing them how to talk about adoption, and giving them tools to know how to answer some of the tough questions that kids get asked a lot. We really like to encourage relatives to know that they don't have to do this alone, and that getting professional support to have some of these really difficult conversations with kids is really important. Kids need to know the truth about their birth parents, and they need to know their story, and sometimes it's hard to do that. Sometimes I think caregivers protect children by not wanting them to know the truth about their birth parents, but kids have the right to know at different developmental times in their lives that can understand more. And so we want to be able to give them those tools so that they don't feel like they're, number one, doing this by themselves, but number two, as kids develop and move into various developmental stages of their lives, that they're prepared for that. We talked a little bit about boundaries, and I want to just talk about visitation a little bit. One of the things that a lot of counties do in a lot of states are what we call icebreakers, and it's really recommended. We can get birth parents and caregivers to meet together with a neutral party and talk about some of these really important issues about visitation. And we talked about some of these a little earlier, so I'm not going to repeat them, but sometimes something as simple as what food you can bring to a visit can really impact. If you have the relative caregiver who maybe is very healthy and organic, and then, birth mom brings McDonald's for the kids. What we don't want is those kinds of things to interfere with the visits that children can have. And we don't want animosity. Some things we talk about, some things I suggest to parents is that they keep, relatives keep a journal, and it lists all the things that the kids did during the week, so that when birth parents are having the visit, they get to see that. They don't feel left out. They feel like they're a part of the child's life. And sometimes they're able to be more a part of a child's life, depending on, what's happening in their situation and how they're taking care of their needs and meeting whatever the plans that are agreed upon. And so maybe the caregiver, maybe the birth parent is able to go to Johnny's soccer game or the school dance recital. Maybe they do homework together on a visit, and that can be arranged ahead of time so that everybody's on the same page. Most importantly, we need birth parents to respect a caregiver's authority and give children permission to accept that. And if they're not willing to do that, that can make visits very, very challenging. We need to think about, is that then is it safe for those children to be in those visits? We also need caregivers to accept the birth parents' role, that they'll always be their birth parents, and that, again, that need for connection is really important. We need to support the placement adoption if that's the goal, and birth parents, need to be able to do that. If they're undermining their relatives, if they're saying, I'm not going to let you go there, you can't live in that house, I don't want you there, or they're saying, mean or hurtful things about the relative caregivers, then, visits may not be safe. Or they may need to be supervised by a neutral party who can support and help educate the birth parents about the needs of the relatives, as well as how to keep children safe in visits. You know, what brainstorming ways that they can communicate if they can't communicate face-to-face. So things like a journal, you know, pictures or letters, different things that different ways that they can that communication can be developed and can happen continuously. It may mean that it's a third-party person who helps that to happen. Ideally, we want birth parents and caregivers to be able to develop enough of a relationship to communicate about the needs of the child, which, you know, can happen much easier sometimes with relatives than non-relatives, but it can also be very sticky. You know, there are plenty of ways for those caregivers, those birth parents, for whatever reasons, cannot be in a child's life. It's really important that we provide ways for those kids to remain connected. And I think that sometimes in families, they forget, because it's just, they feel connected, but they forget sometimes that those children might have been removed really young. And so keeping those stories alive, and there's so many more opportunities in relative caregivers homes, because they have that history with the family. They understand so many more of the nuances of that parent and when they were kids, and they have those good memories about them. And so it can be really, really wonderful for that experience. Doing things like life books and keeping kids' history close by, and filling it with those memories or letters from birth parents, if that can happen. And then really the issue is knowing that this is an ongoing discussion for the rest of their lives, that it's not a conversation that parents and the caregivers and children have once, but throughout the very different developmental milestones in their lives. Moving from this concept of placement, permanency, to adoption, we have a lot of caregivers who say, you know, I don't really want to adopt, I just want to take legal guardianship because, you know, I'm hoping that my children can still step up and take care of the children. I don't really feel like I want to sever that relationship. I feel like I'm taking that child away from, you know, my daughter or my son or my brother or sister. So it can be very difficult. So we really have to prepare and help caregivers understand that adoption sometimes is what really helps kids to feel like they're in that permanent placement, and also takes a lot of risk out of the situation for caregivers. You know, there's a lot of, I think, angst sometimes that happens with relatives, you know, wondering if the birth parents will, you know, try to fight for custody and try to get the kids back after they've raised them for now many, many years. Or what if they come back and they're not healthy, or they're not able to keep the kids safe again? So adoption certainly is one way that they can guarantee that they will be able to keep custody of those children. But caregivers really need to be able to understand the needs of the birth parents, but they also need to make sure that they need to put the child first, and that their role is really, as much as they love, let's say, their birth child, to be able to really know that they have to focus on that child. Carers, they need to have an understanding of child's emotional and physical needs. They have to be able to contribute to their healing. That a child appears to be able to talk freely about birth parents, that they feel like they're starting to resolve some of the dual loyalty issues. Caregivers and children have access to or know how to connect to support and services. Part of, I think, our jobs in working with birth parents is to really teach them how to be advocates. Again, if you don't know how to advocate or for services for kids, or maybe they've never had to, they've never raised a child with special needs, this is brand new territory, and it can be an overwhelming task. So I think that a lot of time needs to be spent in that area. So we're coming to the end of the presentation, and I think we might have some time for questions, and I'm not sure. Cindy, are you or Nicole on the line?
Hi, Edie. It's Michelle with Harmony. We do have one question for you, actually. It says, will we be able to get a copy of the presentation? And I think I can go ahead and answer that question for everyone. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation will not be available. However, the full webinar will be available on our Harmony website. If you go to our main webpage, it will be under Post-Adoption Conference, and there will be a link to all the webinars. This particular webinar, today's webinar, will be available by tomorrow. I believe that was all the questions we have. So we want to thank Edie for such a great job. We hope everyone's enjoyed today's webinar. Our sincere thanks and appreciation to Edie for taking the time to present on such an important topic. Please plan to join us at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, November 11th for the next ASAP post-conference webinar entitled Trusting Up the Ark, which will be presented by Kathleen Bush with the Keeping the Promise Adoption Preservation Program at the Baby Fold. Until then, take care and have a great rest of the week.